Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into Kash Patel's book, Government Gangsters: The Deep State, the Truth, and the Battle for Our Democracy.
Oh, yeah. I've heard about this one.
Yeah, it's making some waves.
For sure.
And, Kash Patel served in a bunch of different roles in the Trump administration.
Right. Public defender, federal prosecutor.
Yeah, he was even a top aide to President Trump himself.
So he's definitely got some stories to tell.
Oh, yeah. And he really dives into the whole deep state thing in this book.
Yeah, how it's supposedly tried to undermine Trump and the whole America First agenda.
And the thing is, the government actually tried to stop him from publishing it.
Really?
Yeah, they redacted a bunch of stuff during the pre-publication review.
Wow, so there's a whole lot we're not even getting to see.
Exactly. It makes you wonder what they're so afraid of us knowing.
Definitely adds to the intrigue.
So to really understand what's going on here, I think we need to go chapter by chapter and see what Patel has to say.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so chapter 1 is called A Note from the Author on the Government Gangsters.
Okay, so right off the bat, he's talking about this government pushback against the book.
Yeah, and he also kind of gives you his background, all the different jobs he's had.
Right, because he didn't just pop up in the White House out of nowhere.
Yeah, and he's making a really bold claim here.
Which is?
He's saying that the deep state is real and that they'll do anything to hold on to their power.
Wow, so he's not holding back at all.
Not one bit.
And then in chapter 2, he takes us back to his time as a public defender in Miami.
Yeah, due process and the public defender. That one really gives you a sense of his commitment to justice.
Yeah, he seems really idealistic in that chapter.
He is, but he also talks about how some of his colleagues weren't really living up to those ideals.
How so?
Well, it said some public defenders would be all about defending, robbers and murderers.
Okay.
But they'd balk at representing someone accused of sexual assault.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Patel saw that as a huge problem.
Yeah, everyone deserves a fair defense regardless of what they're accused of.
Exactly. And he carried that principle with him throughout his whole career.
Makes sense?
Then there's this one story in chapter 2 about a drug case.
Oh, yeah. What happened there?
So Patel catches a federal prosecutor making a Brady violation.
A Brady what now?
Oh, sorry. Basically, it means the prosecutor withheld evidence that could have helped the defendant.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a big no-no.
I bet that shook him up.
Oh, yeah. He was disillusioned by the whole thing.
Understandably so.
And then that disillusionment just gets worse when he becomes a federal prosecutor himself.
That's chapter 3, right?
Yeah. Tajikistan and prosecuting the Benghazi terrorists.
So he's moving up in the world.
He is, but he's also facing new challenges.
Like what?
Well, he had to deal with this one judge who kept throwing him out of court for no good reason.
What?
Yeah. And then there was the whole Benghazi investigation.
Oh, man, that was a mess.
Tell me about it. Patel says the DOJ was more worried about looking good than actually getting justice.
So they weren't really trying to find the truth.
Not really. They were more concerned with how things would look in the media.
Wow. So he was already starting to see this deep state in action.
Exactly. He even refused to join the Benghazi trial team because he didn't trust what was going on.
That's pretty telling.
It is. And then in chapter 4, when politics obstructs justice, he really starts laying out his case against the deep state.
So this is where he gets specific.
Yeah, he moves beyond just his own experiences and starts giving examples of this pattern of corruption he's seeing.
So what kind of examples does he give?
Well, he talks about the case of Steve Bannon.
Trump's former strategist.
Right, and how he was charged with contempt of Congress.
Yeah, I remember that.
But then he contrasts that with, John Brennan and James Clapper.
The former CIA director and director of national intelligence.
Yep, and how they lied to Congress but never faced any consequences.
Interesting.
So Patel's arguing that there's this double standard in the justice system.
Where people in power, especially if they're Democrats, get away with stuff that ordinary people wouldn't.
Exactly. And then he also gets into how he was personally targeted.
Oh, right. He was accused of mishandling classified information.
Yeah, and he says the media just ran with that story without even checking the facts.
And he blames the media for helping the deep state.
Yeah, he says they just repeat whatever the deep state feeds them.
That's a pretty serious accusation.
It is, but he doesn't just complain about the problem, he offers solutions.
Oh, like what?
He says we need an attorney general who's actually fair and impartial.
Okay.
And we need clear standards for prosecution, so it's not just based on politics.
Makes sense.
And of course, we need to hold high-level officials accountable for their actions.
So he thinks the system can be fixed.
Yeah, he's not giving up hope yet.
Good, because it's easy to get cynical about all this stuff.
It is, but then in Chapter 5, House staffer, we follow him to Capitol Hill.
Right, he goes to work for the House Intelligence Committee.
Yeah, under Devin Nunes, they were investigating the whole Russiagate thing.
Ah, so now he's on the other side of the investigation.
He is, and he says he was determined to follow the facts wherever they led.
Even if it meant going against the prevailing narrative.
Exactly. And he had this whole 3Cs approach to the investigation.
What was that?
He was looking for evidence of conspiracy, collusion, or coordination between the Trump campaign and Russia.
And what did he find?
Well, according to Patel, after interviewing over 60 witnesses, not a single one had any evidence of collusion.
So he's saying the whole thing was a big nothing burger?
Pretty much, and this really sets the stage for his later accusations about a deep state plot to take down Trump.
Right, because if there was no collusion, then why was everyone making such a big deal about it?
Exactly. And of course, Patel didn't come out of this unscathed.
What do you mean?
He says he was threatened by the DOJ just for doing his job.
Seriously?
Yeah, they tried to intimidate him into backing off the investigation.
Wow, that's messed up.
It is.
Yeah.
And he ended up going to the press to expose those threats.
Good for him.
Yeah, he wasn't going to be silenced.
So he's really painting himself as this outsider fighting against the establishment.
He is, and this whole experience really solidified his belief in the deep state.
Because he saw firsthand how they operate.
Exactly. And then we get to Chapter 6, the Nunes memo, and things really start to heat up.
Oh, yeah, that was a bombshell.
It revealed that the FBI had used the Steele dossier to get a FISA warrant to spy on Carter Page.
Who was?
Oh, right, sorry. He was a former advisor to the Trump campaign.
Oh.
And the thing is, a FISA warrant is a pretty big deal.
How so?
It's not like a regular warrant. It's used to spy on suspected spies or terrorists.
So they're basically accusing Carter Page of being a traitor.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And they were using this dossier full of unverified rumors and salacious allegations to justify it.
And it gets even worse, right?
Oh, yeah. Patel says the FBI left out some key information when they went to the FISA court.
Like what?
Well, they didn't tell the court that the Steele dossier was actually funded by the Clinton campaign and the DNC.
Oh, wow. So they were basically using opposition research to spy on their political opponents.
Exactly.
And that's a huge problem.
It is, and Patel argues that this wasn't just a mistake. It was a deliberate attempt to mislead the court.
And undermine the Trump campaign.
Exactly. He even claims that they doctored some of Page's comments to make him look guilty.
Oh, man.
And they hid evidence that could have helped him.
So they were really out to get him.
It seems that way.
And then the Nunes memo also mentions some other things, right?
Yeah, like the whole Alpha Bank thing.
What was that again?
Oh, it was this theory that Trump had this secret server communicating with a Russian bank.
Right.
And then there was the meeting between George Papadopoulos and that Australian diplomat.
Alexander Downer.
Right. He supposedly told Papadopoulos that the Russians had dirt on Hillary Clinton.
So it was all supposed to be part of this big Russian plot to help Trump win the election.
Yeah, but Patel argues that none of it was true.
So he's basically saying the whole Russiagate thing was a made-up scandal.
Pretty much. And in Chapter 7, The Snakes Bite Back, he describes the backlash he and Nunes faced for releasing the memo.
Oh, yeah. People were not happy.
Especially the deep state, they went after them hard.
I bet.
Yeah, and Patel says this just proves how far they'll go to protect themselves.
So they're willing to attack anyone who tries to expose them.
Exactly.
It's kind of scary when you think about it.
It is. And then Adam Schiff, the Democrat on the Intelligence Committee,
Right.
he launched this whole disinformation campaign to discredit the Nunes memo.
Oh, wow. So he was basically trying to cover up the FBI's wrongdoing.
Yeah, and Patel says he couldn't even defend himself because Schiff was using classified information.
So he had the truth, but couldn't reveal it.
Exactly. It was a classic catch-22.
And then, to make matters worse, Robert Mueller was appointed a special counsel.
Yeah, and that just added fuel to the whole Russiagate fire.
Even though there was no evidence of collusion.
Right, and Patel argues that the Mueller investigation was basically a charade.
A way to keep the illusion of a scandal alive.
Yeah, and to protect the people who were actually responsible for the whole mess.
So he's saying Mueller was part of the deep state, too.
He is, and it's a pretty serious accusation.
It is, and it really makes you wonder if anyone can hold these people accountable.
It's a good question, and we'll dive into Patel's answers to that question in part 2 of this deep dive.
Sounds good.
Thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please help support our channel by clicking the like and subscribe button. Thank you.
So where were we? Yes, the Mueller investigation and this supposed deep state conspiracy.
Right, and in Chapter 9, The Fix, Patel lays out his plan to, fix it all. He wants to reform the whole system.
What kind of reforms is he talking about? It sounds like he's got some pretty big ideas.
Oh, yeah, he's not messing around. He wants to start by completely overhauling the way special counsels operate.
Okay, how so? What's wrong with the current system?
He thinks they have too much power, and are too easily influenced by D.C. politics.
Yeah.
So he wants to move them out of D.C. entirely.
Wow, really? That's a pretty drastic step.
It is, but he's serious. No more D.C. grand juries either. He wants to limit their scope and staff, too. Basically make it harder for them to become these runaway trains.
Makes sense, I guess. If you think they're being weaponized for political purposes, then taking away some of their power might be the answer. What else?
He's got a whole plan for the FBI, too. Wants to relocate their headquarters, get rid of a bunch of lawyers, and make sure the DOJ is involved in every investigation.
So he's basically trying to rein in the FBI, make sure they're not operating in the shadows.
Exactly. He doesn't trust them to police themselves. And then, get this, he even wants to reform the FISA court.
The FISA court, what would that even look like?
Well, he wants judges with longer terms, public defenders for anyone targeted by FISA warrants, and a whole lot more transparency. He thinks the whole process is too secretive right now.
Yeah, all that secrecy definitely breeds suspicion. So is Patel basically saying that the whole system is rigged against outsiders like Trump?
That's the gist of it, yeah. He thinks the D.C. establishment has too much power and uses it to protect itself and punish anyone who challenges the status quo.
It's a pretty cynical view of government, but I can see how someone who's been through what he has might come to that conclusion.
Right, and he's not just complaining, he's actually trying to come up with solutions, even if they are kind of radical. But before we get too deep into that, we got to go back to the Ukraine impeachment saga. Chapter 10, Impeachment Round 2, Ukraine.
Oh man, that was a wild time. Wasn't Patel accused of being involved in some kind of back channel?
Yeah, the whole thing was about Trump supposedly pressuring Ukraine to investigate the Bidens.
Yeah.
Patel says he had nothing to do with it.
But why would he be accused in the first place?
He blames it on some disgruntled staffers working for John Bolton, Trump's national security advisor at the time. Says they were out to get him and sabotage Trump.
So it was all just political maneuvering, nothing to do with actual wrongdoing.
That's what Patel claims. He says Fiona Hill, who testified during the impeachment trial, even admitted that she didn't actually have any knowledge of Patel's involvement in Ukraine.
Interesting. It's amazing how these political battles can just consume everything, even when there's no real evidence of anything.
Yeah, and it just shows how easily people can get caught up in the crossfire, even if they're just trying to do their jobs. But amidst all this chaos and drama, Patel still managed to get some things done. Chapter 11, The Good, is all about his efforts to bring American hostages home.
Oh, wow. That's a side of him you don't hear about very often. So he was involved in hostage negotiations.
Big time. He says he helped bring back more American captives than anyone else in recent history. Worked with the families, negotiated with foreign governments, even went to Syria to meet with the Assad regime.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. It sounds like he was willing to put himself in some pretty dangerous situations.
He was, and he says he did it because it was the right thing to do. He even had this custom bourbon barrel made to celebrate each successful hostage release.
That's kind of cool, actually. A little reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's still some good happening in the world.
Definitely. But then, of course, we get back to the bad stuff in Chapter 12, starting with the operation to kill ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi.
Ah, yes, the Baghdadi raid. That was a huge win for the Trump administration. What kind of details does Patel share about that?
Oh, he takes you right inside the Situation Room. The whole planning process, the intelligence gathering, the moment Trump gave the go-ahead, you really feel like you're there with them.
That's got to be intense, knowing that you're making decisions that could have life or death consequences.
It is, and Patel doesn't shy away from the emotional side of it either. He describes his own reaction when they got confirmation that Baghdadi was dead, and then the somber moment when Trump informed the families of Baghdadi's victims about the successful raid.
It's a reminder that these operations, as successful as they might be, still come at a cost. Real people are affected by these decisions.
Absolutely. And then in Chapter 13, Declassification, we get back to Patel's struggles with the intelligence community. This time, it's all about his efforts to carry out Trump's orders to declassify sensitive information.
Right, because Trump was always talking about draining the swamp and exposing the deep state. Was Patel able to make any headway on that?
He says he tried, but he ran into a wall of opposition. The intelligence agencies were determined to keep their secrets, even if it meant obstructing the president.
Why would they do that? What were they so afraid of?
Patel thinks they were just trying to protect themselves and their power. They didn't want the public to know what they were up to, especially when it came to things like Russiagate.
Makes sense, I guess. If you've got something to hide, you're not going to want anyone shining a light on it.
Right. But eventually, Trump appointed John Ratcliffe as Director of National Intelligence, and then Rick Grinnell, both of whom were more open to declassification. Patel actually served as Grinnell's deputy, which is a pretty big deal.
Why is that?
He was the first minority to hold that position, and Grinnell was the first openly gay cabinet secretary. It was a sign that things are starting to change, at least a little bit.
That's true. Representation matters. But did they actually manage to declassify anything significant?
Well, that's a whole other story. But Patel's commitment to transparency is clear. In Chapter 14, Open Source Everything, he makes the case for making as much government information as possible publicly available.
So he's basically saying that the government should be more accountable to the people.
Exactly. He thinks the current classification system is too secretive and easily abused. He wants to open things up, let the sun shine in.
I can get behind that. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, as they say.
He's even started his own organization, fightwithcash.com, to release documents related to Russiagate, January 6th, and other controversial events.
Wow, he's really putting his money where his mouth is. So he's not just talking about transparency, he's actually trying to make it happen.
Yeah, he is. And then in Chapter 15, the General Flynn frame-up, he goes back to the case of Michael Flynn, Trump's former national security advisor.
Oh, yeah, the whole thing with the FBI and the Russia investigation. What's Patel's take on that?
He thinks Flynn was set up. He says the FBI used a leaked and illegally unmasked phone call between Flynn and the Russian ambassador to entrap him.
Hold on, what's unmasking?
It's when intelligence agencies intercept communications involving foreigners, and they're supposed to hide the identities of any Americans who are mentioned. But in Flynn's case, his name was unmasked without proper authorization.
So people who weren't supposed to know who he was were able to find out.
Exactly. And Patel says this was done deliberately to hurt Flynn and fuel the Russiagate narrative.
That's pretty shady. So he's basically saying that the FBI was trying to sabotage the Trump administration from the inside?
That's his argument. And he goes on to list all the Obama administration officials who unmasked Flynn's name, implying that this was a coordinated effort.
That's a lot to unpack. But it definitely fits with Patel's overall narrative about the dope state.
Right. And then we get to Chapter 16, Reforming the Intel Community, where he lays out his plan to fix the intelligence agencies.
This should be interesting. What kind of reforms is he proposing?
Well, he thinks the whole intelligence community is too big, too bureaucratic, and too unaccountable. So he wants to streamline it, make it more efficient, and most importantly, make it more accountable to the people.
Sounds like a tall order. How does he plan to do all that?
He wants to start by cutting back the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the ODNI. He thinks it's become too bloated and focused on the wrong things.
So less bureaucracy, more focus on the actual mission.
Exactly. And he also wants to reform civil service laws that he thinks protect bureaucrats from accountability.
Makes sense. If you can't fire people who are doing a bad job or obstructing the president's agenda, then how can you hold them accountable?
Right. And he goes even further, proposing to ban public sector unions and revoke security clearances for former officials who misuse them for political gain.
Wow, those are some pretty radical proposals. But it sounds like he's trying to address what he sees as a fundamental imbalance of power in Washington.
He is. And then in Chapter 17, he turns his attention to the Pentagon.
Oh, so now he's taking on the military-industrial complex.
He is. He argues that there's a forever war party in the Pentagon that benefits from endless wars and resists any attempts to bring troops home.
It's a common critique, especially from those who are skeptical of military interventionism.
Right. And Patel claims that Trump faced a lot of pushback from the Pentagon when he tried to end the wars in Afghanistan and Syria. He even points to the firing of Mark Esper as Secretary of Defense as evidence of this resistance.
Was Esper part of this forever war party?
Patel thinks so. He says Esper, who used to work for a defense contractor, was more interested in protecting the interests of the military-industrial complex than in following Trump's orders.
That's a pretty serious accusation. So who did Trump replace him with?
Chris Miller, who Patel describes as a competent and apolitical leader. He says Miller actually tried to implement Trump's agenda of bringing troops home.
But didn't that whole withdrawal from Afghanistan end up being a disaster?
It did, but Patel blames that on the Biden administration, saying they mishandled the whole thing. He also criticizes General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, for supposedly going behind Trump's back and making deals with the Chinese.
That's a pretty explosive allegation. So Patel is basically saying that the military was working against Trump, trying to undermine his policies.
That's his view, yeah. And he also expresses concern about what he sees as wokeness in the military, arguing that it's weakening our fighting force.
Wokeness? What does he mean by that?
He's talking about things like diversity training, sensitivity to transgender issues, and other social justice initiatives that he thinks are distracting the military from its core mission of fighting wars.
That's a pretty common critique from conservatives. They see these initiatives as a form of political correctness that's undermining military readiness.
Right, and Patel is definitely on that side of the argument. But then we move on to chapters 18, Peaceful Transition of Power, and January 6th, where he gives his insider account of the Capitol riot.
Oh man, that was a dark day in American history. What does Patel have to say about that?
He was at the Pentagon that day, overseeing the transition of power to the Biden administration. He says the DoD was prepared for potential unrest, but was prevented from deploying the National Guard quickly enough because of bureaucratic roadblocks.
So he's saying that the government could have prevented the riot if they had acted more decisively.
That's his argument. He disputes the narrative that January 6th was an insurrection, arguing that it was just a chaotic protest that got out of control.
That's a pretty controversial take. Most people would say that storming the Capitol is a pretty clear attempt to overturn the government.
Right. But Patel sees it differently. He's especially critical of the way the DOJ has treated the January 6th defendants, arguing that they're being unfairly persecuted. He even suggests that the FBI might have had informants who instigated the violence.
Wow, that's a serious accusation. It sounds like he's trying to turn the whole narrative about January 6th on its head.
He is, and this ties into his broader argument about the deep state criminalizing dissent. In Chapter 19, Made Up Domestic Terrorism, he claims that the government is using the domestic terrorism label to silence anyone who disagrees with them, especially Trump supporters.
So he's basically saying that the Biden administration is trying to silence its political opponents.
That's his view. He points to the memo labeling parents who oppose critical race theory as domestic terrorists as evidence of this trend.
Yeah, that was a pretty controversial memo. Definitely raised some concerns about free speech and the right to protest.
Right. And Patel sees this as part of a broader pattern of the deep state trying to control the narrative and suppress any dissenting voices.
It's a pretty chilling thought. If the government can label anyone who disagrees with them as a domestic terrorist, then what's to stop them from using the full force of the law to silence them?
Exactly. And this leads us to Chapter 20, Truth Social, where Patel talks about the efforts to censor conservatives online and the creation of Truth Social as an alternative platform.
Oh yeah, Trump's social media platform. What's Patel's involvement in that?
He's on the board of Truth Social. He describes it as a haven for free speech, a place where conservatives can express themselves without fear of being censored by big tech.
So he's basically saying that Truth Social is the answer to big tech censorship.
He is. He thinks social media companies like Twitter and Facebook have become too powerful and are biased against conservatives.
It's a common complaint among conservatives that big tech is trying to silence their voices.
Right. And Patel sees Truth Social as a way to fight back, to create a platform where conservative viewpoints can be heard without being filtered or suppressed.
It's an interesting idea, but it remains to be seen whether Truth Social can actually compete with the likes of Twitter and Facebook.
True, but Patel is optimistic. He believes that Truth Social can become a major force in the social media landscape and provide a much-needed alternative to the big tech giants.
We'll have to wait and see how that plays out. But it's clear that Patel is deeply concerned about the state of free speech in America and the power of big tech to control the flow of information.
He is, and in the final chapters, Chapter 21, The Biden Deep State, and Darkest Before the Dawn, and Chapter 22, Reclaiming Our Republic, he offers his concluding thoughts.
Okay, let's hear it. What's his final verdict?
Well, it's not exactly uplifting. He basically argues that the deep state is more powerful and more open than ever before.
So it's not just a shadowy force lurking in the background anymore.
Not according to Patel. He thinks they're operating right out in the open now, using federal agencies to target their political opponents.
That's a pretty serious accusation. Does he give any examples?
He points to the memo labeling parents who oppose critical race theory as domestic terrorists, the attempt to create a disinformation governance board, all that stuff.
Yeah, those are pretty controversial moves. It definitely seemed like the government was trying to crack down on dissent.
And Patel sees that as a very dangerous trend. He thinks the deep state's ultimate goal is to create a one-party state where they have total control.
That's a pretty bleak outlook. So is he just giving up hope?
Not entirely. He does end on a somewhat optimistic note. He talks about the resilience of the America First movement and the importance of continuing to fight for freedom.
So he's basically saying that we can't give up. We have to keep pushing back against the deep state.
Exactly. He thinks the deep state can be defeated, but only if the American people wake up and realize the threat they pose.
It's a call to action, then.
It is. He's urging people to get involved, hold their elected officials accountable, and demand change. He thinks the future of American democracy depends on it.
It's a powerful message, and it's definitely one that resonates with a lot of people, especially those who feel like the system is rigged against them.
Right. And then, in Reclaiming Our Republic, he lays out his plan to dismantle the deep state and restore power to the people.
Okay, let's hear it. What's his grand plan?
Well, it's pretty comprehensive. He talks about reforming everything from the civil service and the FBI to the intelligence community, the Department of Defense, and even the electoral system.
Wow, he's not thinking small. So what are some of the key elements of his plan?
He wants to limit the power of unelected bureaucrats, increase transparency and accountability, and make it easier to fire federal employees who are incompetent or insubordinate.
So she's basically trying to take power away from the bureaucracy and give it back to the people and their elected representatives.
Exactly. He thinks that's the only way to fix the system and restore the balance of power.
It's a bold vision, that's for sure. And it's one that's likely to be met with a lot of resistance from the very people he's trying to reform.
No doubt about it. But Patel seems determined to fight for his vision of a more accountable and transparent government.
Well, whether you agree with him or not, you have to admire his passion and his willingness to speak truth to power.
That's for sure. He's not afraid to challenge the status quo or to call out those he believes are abusing their power.
And in a time when so many people feel like they've lost their voice, that's a pretty inspiring message.
It is, and it's something we should all keep in mind, regardless of our political beliefs.
Absolutely. Government Gangsters is a provocative and timely book that raises some important questions about the state of our democracy and the role of government in our lives.
If you're interested in learning more about Patel's perspective and his proposed solutions, I highly recommend checking out the book for yourself. It's definitely a thought-provoking read, even if you don't agree with everything he has to say.
I second that. It's a book that will stay with you long after you finish it, and it's sure to spark some interesting conversations.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Government Gangsters. We hope you found it informative and insightful.
And as always, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep the conversation going.
So yeah, a lot to think about there.
Definitely, Patel's book really gets you thinking about who's really in charge.
Right. And how much power these unelected officials actually have.
And whether the system is even fixable at this point.
It's a pretty bleak picture he paints.
It is, but I think there's also a sense of hope in there, too.
Yeah, he does believe that things can get better.
But only if people wake up and start demanding change.
Exactly. He's really urging people to get involved, to hold their elected officials accountable.
And to fight for their freedoms.
Because ultimately, that's what it comes down to, right?
Yeah, the future of our democracy depends on it.
Well said. Well said. So I guess the big question is, what do we do with all this information?
Wait, where do we go from here?
Patel obviously has his own ideas, his whole plan for dismantling the deep state.
Which is ambitious, to say the least.
Yeah, it is. But even if you don't agree with everything he says, I think his book is worth reading.
Oh, absolutely. It's thought-provoking, it's challenging.
And it really makes you question everything you thought you knew about how power works in Washington.
It definitely gives you a new perspective.
So yeah, I would definitely recommend Government Gangsters to anyone who's interested in, in the deep state, in the Trump administration.
And in the future of American democracy.
Exactly. It's a book that everyone should be talking about.
And we hope we've given you some food for thought today.
We have. And as always, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Keep questioning, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep the conversation going.